This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The people who work the hardest are usually the ones no one sees. At 3:07 a.m., the kitchen lights were dimmed to half power, casting long silver reflections across stainless steel counters that still smelled faintly of lemon detergent and overcooked steak. The dining room of Whitmore and Company had been empty for nearly 3 hours, the last black SUV pulling away just before midnight. But in the back, where the industrial sinks hummed and hot water steamed against tile, Emily Hayes was still standing. The clock above the prep station ticked with quiet authority. 3:07. She flexed her fingers once before lowering them back into the soapy water. The gloves she wore had torn at the fingertips hours ago, and the water had long since seeped in, leaving her knuckles red and raw, but she did not slow down. Plate, rinse, scrub, stack, repeat. She moved with a rhythm that suggested practice, not complaint. Her apron was damp at the hem. A loose strand of chestnut hair clung to her cheek. Outside, late March air hovered just under 40 degrees, and the alley behind the restaurant was slick from a thin evening rain. But inside, the kitchen held its own kind of weather, humid, quiet, relentless. She paused only once, leaning lightly against the edge of the sink for exactly 3 seconds before straightening again, as if even exhaustion had been allotted a strict time limit. Upstairs, in the private office overlooking the street, Daniel Whitmore stood by the window with his jacket folded neatly over his arm. He had not planned to stay this late. The acquisition papers had been signed that afternoon, the final numbers reviewed twice, the congratulatory calls taken in stride. Whitmore Hospitality had just absorbed its 15th property in 5 years. Investors were pleased. The board was satisfied. Expansion into the Northeast Corridor was officially complete. And yet, instead of heading home to his penthouse 12 blocks south, Daniel had returned to the restaurant floor just after 2:45 a.m., telling himself he needed one last look at the place before renovations began. He noticed small things: the polish on the bar, the alignment of the chairs, the faint scuff mark near the entrance. Details mattered. They always had. What he had not expected was the sound. A steady rush of water echoing from the back corridor. He checked his watch, an understated Swiss piece that rarely left his wrist. 3:07. No one should have been there. The manager had confirmed that staff clocked out by midnight. He walked down the narrow hallway, dress shoes quiet against the tile, and stopped just before the kitchen threshold. Through the half-open swinging door, he saw her. Not crying, not complaining, just working. The overhead light caught the edge of her profile as she lifted another rack of dishes into the sanitizer. Steam rose around her like mist. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He had seen hundreds of employees over the years: hosts, bartenders, chefs, servers, most efficient, some indifferent, a few ambitious. But this felt different. There was no audience here, no supervisor, no incentive, just a young woman standing alone at an industrial sink at 3 in the morning as if the world depended on it. He stepped inside, the hinge of the door giving a faint metallic sigh. She turned quickly, startled but composed, pushing damp hair behind her ear. Her eyes met his, clear and steady. Not defensive, not impressed. "We're closed," she said softly, voice even. Then she noticed his suit, the watch, the posture. I thought everyone had left." Daniel studied her for half a second longer than necessary. "It's 3 a.m., he said. Not accusatory, simply factual. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." Her hands returned to the water. "Plate, rinse, stack. Why are you still here?" he asked. The question lingered in the steam between them. She did not look up immediately. "Because she's still breathing." The words were calm, measured, as if she had said them before. Daniel felt something shift, small but unmistakable. "Who?" he asked. She lifted the rack from the sink, set it into the drying slot, and finally met his eyes again. "My mom." There was no dramatic pause. No attempt to draw sympathy. Just information. "She's at St. Matthew's. Cardiac floor. Insurance only covers part of it." She reached for another stack of plates. "So I stay?" Daniel glanced at the clock again, then back at her hands. The torn gloves. The reddened skin. "Your shift ended hours ago." "Yes, sir. And they don't pay overtime for this." It wasn't a question. A faint, almost amused breath left her lips. "No, sir." He watched as she wiped down the counter with deliberate care, aligning each clean plate with quiet precision. You know this building changes ownership tomorrow, he said. New policies. New management. I heard. She did not flinch. If I lose the job, I'll find another. At 3 in the morning, he asked. For the first time, a flicker of something passed across her face. Not frustration, not fear. Resolve. If I have to. Silence settled again, broken only by the hum of the dishwasher cycling through heat. Daniel had built an empire by reading balance sheets, predicting markets, outmaneuvering competitors. He understood leverage, risk, return. But standing in that dim kitchen, watching a young woman scrub porcelain long after the lights were meant to be off, he realized there were forms of capital that never appeared on paper. Discipline, loyalty, love. He glanced once more at the clock. 3:12 a.m. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated, just briefly. Emily Hayes. He nodded. I'm Daniel Whitmore. This time, she did look at him differently, not impressed, but aware. The name meant something. Everyone in hospitality knew it. She didn't straighten her posture, didn't apologize, didn't ask for anything. She simply returned to the sink. Plate, rinse, stack. And Daniel Whitmore, billionaire investor, stood there longer than he had intended, watching the one employee in the entire building who wasn't working for applause. Daniel did not leave immediately. He stood in that humid kitchen for another full minute after she said her name, as if committing it to memory. Emily Hayes. It sounded steady, uncomplicated. He glanced around the room, at the polished counters and the quiet machinery that would soon be upgraded under his direction, and then back at her. She had already resumed her rhythm, fully aware of who he was and entirely uninterested in performing for him. That unsettled him more than flattery ever could. Most people adjusted their tone when they learned his last name. Their posture changed. Their eyes sharpened with opportunity. Emily simply worked. What time do you have to be at the hospital? He asked. She did not stop scrubbing. Visiting hours start at 8 in the morning. And what time do you sleep? A small pause. Not defensive, just calculating. Usually around 4:30. Sometimes 5. Daniel felt the weight of that answer settle somewhere deeper than expected. He checked his watch again. 3:18. In less than 5 hours she would be sitting beside a hospital bed instead of in her own. You cannot sustain that, he said, almost to himself. She rinsed the last plate and shut off the water. The sudden silence was louder than the hum had been. I do what I can, she replied simply. He studied her face more carefully now. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind that no amount of coffee erased. But there was no resentment there. No plea. Just clarity. How long has she been admitted? He asked. 6 weeks. The number hung in the air. 6 weeks of bills. 6 weeks of forms. 6 weeks of balancing shifts and heart monitors. What does she need? He asked. Emily reached for a clean towel and began drying her hands slowly. A procedure that insurance is calling elective. Her mouth tightened slightly at the word. The cardiologist does not. Daniel had heard that phrase before. Elective. A word that shifted responsibility without solving anything. And the cost. She hesitated this time. Not because she did not know, but because she did. $73,000. She said it without trembling, as if saying it often enough had made it less frightening. Daniel did not react outwardly. He had signed contracts larger than that before lunch on most days. But hearing it spoken in this room, at this hour, in that voice, reframed the number entirely. You think washing dishes covers that? He asked quietly. She folded the towel carefully before answering. Not alone. She met his gaze. But it helps. There it was again. Not desperation. Determination. He walked toward the stainless steel prep table and rested his hand lightly on the surface. Emily, he said, her name deliberate this time. This restaurant will be restructuring operations starting tomorrow. Extended hours like this will not be permitted. She absorbed that without flinching. Then I will pick up shifts somewhere else. You will be exhausted. Probably. A faint trace of humor flickered in her eyes. But she will be breathing. The simplicity of her logic left no room for argument. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had built a life on leverage, on calculating outcomes 3 steps ahead. Yet standing here, he realized there was nothing strategic about her choice. It was instinct. Loyalty without conditions. Does she know? He asked. About this. Emily glanced at the sink. No, why not? Because she would. Tell me to quit. Her voice softened, just slightly. She worked 2 jobs when I was a kid. I am only returning the favor. Something tightened in his chest. He had grown up with comfort. Boarding schools. Summer houses. His parents had provided stability measured in trust funds and careful planning. Sacrifice had existed in theory, not in fluorescent kitchens at 3 in the morning. He straightened. What time are you scheduled tomorrow? 6 p.m. Do not come in, he said. She blinked once. Excuse me. Take the night off. I cannot afford to. You will be paid. Her posture shifted then, subtle but firm. I do not want charity. The words were not sharp, just clear. Daniel nodded once, as if expecting that answer. It is not charity. It is operational discretion. She almost smiled at that. You can call it whatever you like, Mr. Whitmore. Daniel, he corrected quietly. She considered that, then nodded. Daniel. The name sounded different in her voice. Not reverent. Not distant. Just human. He moved toward the door, then paused. Which hospital? St. Matthew's. Cardiac floor. Room 1217. She did not ask why he wanted to know. He appreciated that more than she realized. Go home, he said finally. Sleep. I will. He walked out into the hallway, the cooler air brushing against his face, and for the first time that night the building felt less like an asset and more like a threshold. Behind him, he heard the faint click of lights switching off. By the time he stepped into the damp alley and the city air settled around him, he knew one thing with certainty. He had entered that kitchen as an owner reviewing property. He had left it thinking about a woman who refused to bend. And he was not entirely sure which role felt more powerful. At 7:58 in the morning, the cardiac floor of St. Matthew's Medical Center was washed in pale sunlight that filtered through tall windows overlooking the river. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh coffee, and nurses moved with practiced efficiency between rooms, their shoes whispering across polished linoleum. Emily Hayes sat in a molded plastic chair beside room 1217, her head tilted slightly against the wall, eyes closed but not fully asleep. She had made it home just before 4, set an alarm for 7, and returned with a paper cup of oatmeal and a small bouquet of grocery store daisies that cost $5.99. Her mother, Margaret Hayes, rested quietly in the hospital bed, silver threaded through her dark hair, oxygen tubing resting gently beneath her nose. The heart monitor traced steady green lines across a screen that hummed in rhythm with the room. Emily opened her eyes at the soft shift of her mother's hand. You are here early, Margaret said, voice thin but warm. Emily straightened immediately, pushing fatigue aside like a coat she could hang up later. Visiting hours started, she replied, forcing brightness into her tone. And I brought flowers. They were on sale. Margaret smiled faintly. You should be sleeping. Emily reached for her mother's hand, careful of the foreline. I will sleep later. The words felt familiar now, almost automatic. She did not mention the conversation from hours earlier. She did not mention Daniel Whitmore standing in the kitchen steam with questions in his eyes. Some moments felt too fragile to share before they were understood. Downstairs, in the main lobby framed by glass doors and a revolving entrance, Daniel stepped inside at exactly 8:15. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a tailored suit, tie perfectly aligned, hair still slightly damp from a quick shower. The hospital receptionist glanced up, offering a polite smile that sharpened with recognition as his name signed across the visitor log. Whitmore carried no entourage, no assistant, just a slim leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He paused near the elevator bank, watching families gather in small clusters with balloons and coffee cups, and for a moment he felt out of place in a building that did not measure success in quarterly returns. He pressed the button for the 12th floor. The elevator doors slid shut with a muted chime. As it rose, he reviewed the numbers in his mind. $73,000. A sum insignificant in boardrooms, monumental in kitchens at 3 in the morning. He stepped out into the cardiac wing, the corridor quieter than the lobby below. Room 1217. He stopped just short of the doorway. Through the narrow window, he saw her seated beside the bed, leaning slightly forward, reading softly from a worn paperback novel. Her voice carried gently, steady and clear, each word chosen with care. Margaret listened with eyes half closed, a faint smile resting on her lips. There was no performance here, no exhaustion visible, only presence. Daniel felt something shift again, that same subtle recalibration from the night before. He knocked lightly on the open doorframe. Emily looked up first, surprise flickering across her face before composure returned. She stood slowly. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, then corrected herself. "Daniel." He nodded once. "I hope I am not interrupting." Margaret's gaze moved between them, curious. "Are you the new boss?" she asked gently. Daniel offered a restrained smile. "Something like that." Emily stepped aside slightly, unsure whether to feel grateful or guarded. "This is my mother, Margaret." "It is nice to meet you, Mrs. Hayes," Daniel said, voice measured but sincere. Margaret studied him with quiet intuition that only mothers seem to possess. "You have kind eyes," she said. "Most men in suits do not." A faint warmth touched Daniel's expression. "I will take that as a compliment." Emily crossed her arms lightly, not defensive but protective. "What are you doing here?" she asked, softly enough that it did not sound confrontational. Daniel glanced at the monitor, at the folder in his hand, then back at her. "I met with the hospital administration this morning," he said. The words landed gently, but their meaning traveled further. Emily's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because elective is a flexible word," he replied calmly. "And sometimes it requires clarification." Silence filled the small room, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Emily felt her pulse quicken. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I told you last night. I do not want charity." He held her gaze evenly. "Good," he said, "because this is not charity." He placed the leather folder on the small tray table near the bed. "It is an investment." She frowned slightly. "In what?" "In someone who refuses to quit at 3 in the morning." Margaret's eyes moved between them again, understanding more than either of them spoke aloud. Emily took a slow breath, heart suspended between pride and relief. "I did not ask you to do this." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "That is why it matters." Outside the window, sunlight climbed higher over the river, brightening the room by degrees. Emily looked at her mother, then back at the man who had walked into a kitchen at an hour most people avoided. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire investor, but the man who had stayed longer than necessary to watch her finish her shift. And somewhere beneath the fatigue, beneath the weight of bills and long nights, a small, unfamiliar feeling began to take root. Not dependence, not obligation, something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of trust. The room remained quiet long after Daniel's words settled into the air. Investment. The word felt out of place beside a hospital bed, yet somehow it did not feel wrong. Emily looked at the leather folder on the tray table, as if it might disappear if she blinked too long. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. Daniel did not reach for the folder immediately. He understood that timing mattered. "It means the hospital will reclassify the procedure as medically necessary," he said calmly. "It means the financial department will not be sending you any more letters marked urgent in red ink." Emily swallowed, her eyes searching his face for the hidden cost. "And what do you get in return?" she asked. There was no accusation in the question, only logic. Daniel almost smiled. "You assume I require something." "Everyone does," she replied softly. Margaret shifted slightly in the bed, watching them both with quiet awareness. Daniel stepped closer to the window, allowing sunlight to fall across his shoulder. "You are right," he said. "In my world, nothing moves without exchange. But sometimes the exchange is not money." He turned back toward her. "Sometimes it is perspective." Emily folded her arms loosely, not to distance herself, but to steady her thoughts. "Perspective on what?" "On what matters at 3 in the morning," he answered. The words landed differently this time. She looked down briefly, remembering the steam, the clock, the quiet hum of the dishwasher. "I did not do anything extraordinary," she said. "You showed up," he replied. "Most people do not." Silence stretched gently between them. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "Emily," she said, voice thin but firm, "sometimes pride is heavier than help." Emily moved to her mother's side immediately. "I am not refusing help," she insisted gently. "I just do not want to owe anyone." Daniel nodded once. "Then do not owe me," he said. "Work." She blinked. "Work? Stay at the restaurant," he continued. "Not washing dishes after hours. I want you trained in management. Operations. Scheduling. Inventory. You already understand responsibility. The rest can be taught." The proposal shifted the atmosphere of the room. It was no longer about bills alone. It was about direction. Emily searched his expression carefully, looking for traces of condescension, for signs that this was pity disguised as opportunity. She found none. Why me? She asked quietly. Daniel did not hesitate. Because you stayed. A nurse entered briefly to check the monitor, offering a polite nod to Daniel before stepping back out. The ordinary rhythm of hospital life resumed, yet something had changed. Emily exhaled slowly. You barely know me, she said. I know you work when no one is watching, he replied. That is enough to begin. She glanced at the folder again, then at her mother, who squeezed her hand gently. Margaret's eyes held encouragement rather than pressure. What happens if I say no? Emily asked. Daniel's expression softened. Then I respect that, he said. And I still ensure your mother receives the care she needs. She studied him for a long moment, measuring the sincerity in his tone. You would do that anyway? Yes. The answer was immediate. No negotiation. No conditions. Something fragile inside her shifted again, not surrender, but recognition. He was not offering rescue. He was offering partnership. I will not be a project, she said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in understanding. You are not, he replied. And I am not a savior. A faint smile touched her lips at that. Good, she said. Because I would not trust one. For the first time since entering the room, Daniel laughed softly. It was not the polished chuckle he used at fundraisers. It was genuine. Then we are aligned, he said. Margaret watched them both with a knowing expression that required no explanation. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily along the river road, morning fully awake now. Emily stepped closer to the tray table and opened the folder carefully. Inside were hospital forms, updated statements reflecting zero balance due, and a typed proposal outlining a structured training program at Whitmore Hospitality. Her name was printed at the top in clean black letters. She ran her finger lightly across the page, as if confirming it was real. You prepared this quickly, she observed. Daniel glanced at his watch. I do not waste time. She looked up at him again, this time with something new in her eyes. Not suspicion, not gratitude alone. Respect. Neither do I, she said. The air between them felt steadier now, less charged with uncertainty. When would this training begin? She asked. After your mother's procedure, he replied. Family first. The words carried no performance. Just fact. Emily nodded slowly. Then I accept, she said. Not because she was overwhelmed. Not because she felt indebted. But because she saw the path in front of her widening instead of narrowing. Daniel met her gaze evenly. Good, he said quietly. And in that small hospital room, beneath fluorescent lights and the steady rhythm of a heart monitor, something began that neither of them fully understood yet. Not charity. Not obligation. Something built on the simple truth that both of them, in different ways, had chosen to show up when it mattered. The procedure was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. By Wednesday evening the hospital room felt different, lighter somehow, as if anticipation itself had adjusted the air pressure. Emily sat beside her mother with a legal pad resting on her lap, reviewing the training outline Daniel had left behind. Operations overview. Inventory management. Vendor negotiation. Staff leadership. Each line felt like a doorway she had never imagined walking through. Margaret watched her daughter from the bed, eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. You are reading that like it is a novel, she said softly. Emily glanced up and smiled faintly. It feels like one. Are you afraid? Margaret asked. Emily considered the question honestly. Of the surgery? Yes. Of the opportunity? Also yes. Margaret reached for her hand. Fear does not always mean stop. Emily nodded, absorbing the words quietly. Down the hall, footsteps approached with measured confidence. Daniel appeared at the doorway carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a small white envelope tucked beneath his arm. He wore a navy suit this time, tie loosened slightly as if he had come directly from a meeting. Good evening, he said gently. I hope I am not interrupting. You are not, Margaret replied before Emily could answer. You brought coffee. That is always welcome. He handed 1 cup to Emily. Their fingers brushed briefly, not lingering, but enough to register warmth. Black, he said. You mentioned that is how you take it. Emily looked at him carefully. You remember small details. Small details build large outcomes. He replied. She almost laughed at the familiar business phrasing, but it sounded softer now. More personal. Daniel moved to the window and glanced at the city lights beginning to glow beyond the river. Everything is confirmed for tomorrow, he said calmly. The surgical team is prepared. I spoke with the cardiologist this afternoon. Emily straightened slightly. You did not have to do that. I know. He turned back toward her. But I wanted to. There was no tension in his voice, no attempt to impress. Just quiet consistency. Margaret studied him again with thoughtful eyes. You care more than you admit, she observed. Daniel paused at that, then offered a restrained smile. I am learning to admit it, he said. Emily lowered her gaze to the envelope he still held. What is that? She asked. He stepped closer and placed it gently on the bedside table. Your official employment agreement, he said. It begins next Monday. Flexible hours during your mother's recovery. Full salary. Health benefits. Emily inhaled slowly. Full salary? You will be in training, he clarified. But you will be compensated as a management associate. She looked at the envelope without touching it. Why are you moving so fast? She asked quietly. Daniel met her eyes steadily. Because momentum matters, he replied. If we wait for the perfect moment, we lose it. She held his gaze longer this time, searching for hesitation. She found none. Instead, she saw something steady and unfamiliar. Patience. You are not used to being questioned, she said. No, he admitted. But I am getting used to it. The room felt smaller now, not confined but focused. Outside, the hum of evening traffic blended with the soft beep of the monitor. Emily finally picked up the envelope and ran her thumb along the edge. You know, she said carefully. If this fails, I will not blame you. Daniel tilted his head slightly. It will not fail. You sound very certain. I am. Why? She asked. He hesitated just long enough to make the answer honest. Because you are involved. The simplicity of the statement left no room for deflection. Emily felt warmth rise unexpectedly in her chest. Not the kind born from gratitude alone. Something steadier. Something rooted in respect. Margaret shifted in the bed and cleared her throat gently. Emily, she said, do not let pride block possibility. Emily nodded slowly, eyes still on Daniel. I am not, she said. Then, softer, I am just adjusting. Daniel glanced at his watch, but did not move toward the door. I will be here tomorrow morning, he said. In the waiting room. Emily blinked. You have meetings. They can wait, he replied. The words echoed something she had once said about dishes and breathing. She recognized the symmetry immediately. A faint smile curved her lips. You are not obligated to sit in a hospital for 3 hours. I know. He held her gaze. I want to. Silence settled again, but it was no longer uncertain. It was comfortable. Outside the window, city lights reflected against the darkening river, steady and constant. Emily looked down at the agreement in her hands, then back at the man who had walked into her life through steam and stainless steel. All right, she said quietly. Then we will both show up. Daniel nodded once. We will. And in that small hospital room, beneath fluorescent lights and quiet machines, the line between obligation and choice began to blur into something neither of them had expected. Not a transaction, not a rescue, but the quiet beginning of something built on presence, persistence, and the simple decision to stay when it mattered most. At 8:45 the next morning, the surgical waiting area felt suspended in quiet anticipation. Rows of padded chairs lined the wall beneath a mounted television playing muted morning news, captions scrolling silently across the screen. A coffee machine hummed in the corner beside a rack of outdated magazines. Emily sat upright, hands clasped loosely in her lap, eyes fixed on the double doors marked cardiac surgery. She had not slept much, but exhaustion felt distant compared to the steady pulse of hope pressing against her ribs. Daniel sat beside her, jacket folded neatly over the armrest, tie perfectly aligned despite the early hour. He had arrived before she did. 2 cups of coffee already waiting on the small table between them. He did not check his phone. He did not glance at his watch. For once, time did not feel like something to manage. They said 3 hours. Emily said quietly, more to steady herself than to inform him. That is the estimate, Daniel replied gently. Estimates are not guarantees. She nodded. I know. A nurse passed by offering a reassuring smile. The doors remained closed. Silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was focused. Daniel observed the way Emily's fingers tightened briefly every few minutes before relaxing again. He noticed how she inhaled slowly, counting under her breath without realizing it. She had prepared herself for this moment with the same discipline she used in the kitchen. Show up. Stay steady. Do not panic. You do not have to stay the entire time, she said after a while. I said I would, he replied calmly. She turned toward him. You usually lead board meetings at 9. They will manage without me. You are the chief executive. I am also human, he said quietly. The words settled between them with surprising weight. She studied him more carefully now, noticing the faint lines near his eyes, the way he held his shoulders slightly back even while seated. He looked composed, but not distant. Present. Why does this matter to you so much? She asked softly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the surgical doors as if measuring his response. Because I built my life around acquisition, he said finally. Restaurants, properties, companies. I measure success in growth charts and quarterly gains. But last week, I walked into a kitchen at 3 in the morning and saw someone working with no audience, no contract, no incentive. It forced me to reconsider what value looks like. She listened without interrupting. You think I changed you, she said. I think you reminded me, he replied. There is a difference. The television flickered with images no one watched. A man across the room paced slowly with a cell phone pressed to his ear. A child colored quietly beside her grandmother. Time moved differently in waiting rooms. Slower. Heavier. Emily leaned back against the chair and exhaled. I was afraid you would treat this like a transaction, she admitted. Most people with money do. Daniel turned toward her fully now. And what do you see? She held his gaze. Someone trying not to. A faint smile touched his lips. That is accurate. Minutes blended into each other. At one point, Emily's phone buzzed with a message from a coworker asking if she needed anything. She typed a brief reply and set it aside. Daniel noticed the way she thanked even small gestures. Gratitude without dependency. Around 10:15, a nurse emerged briefly to update families. Everything is proceeding as planned, she said warmly. Emily nodded, shoulders relaxing by degrees. Daniel did not speak, but he placed his hand lightly over hers for a brief moment. Not dramatic, not possessive, just steady reassurance. She looked down at their hands, surprised by how natural it felt. Neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact lingered just long enough to register meaning before gently releasing. At 11:58, the surgical doors opened again. The cardiologist stepped forward, mask lowered, expression calm. The procedure was successful, he said clearly. She is stable and resting. The words did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, allowing hope to land gently rather than crash. Emily exhaled in a way that felt like release after weeks of tension. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry loudly. She simply closed them and let gratitude move through her quietly. Daniel stood beside her, not speaking, simply present. After a moment, she turned toward him. Thank you, she said. The words carried more than appreciation for medical bills. They held recognition, partnership, trust. He shook his head slightly. You showed up, he replied. So did you. The symmetry was no longer accidental. It was shared. As they waited to be allowed into recovery, sunlight filtered through the tall windows, brighter now, almost warm. The day felt different. Not because money had solved the problem, but because two people had chosen presence over distance. Emily glanced at Daniel once more, this time without hesitation. You could have walked away that night, she said quietly. Most would have. He met her gaze steadily. I did not want to. And for the first time, the future no longer felt like something she had to carry alone. Recovery rooms have a different kind of silence. It is softer, hopeful. The steady rhythm of monitored breathing replaces the anxious ticking of waiting room clocks. Emily stood just inside the doorway of her mother's recovery suite, hands clasped lightly in front of her as she watched Margaret sleep. Color had returned faintly to her cheeks. The oxygen line remained, but the tension that had once shadowed her features was gone. For the first time in weeks, the room felt less like a battleground and more like a place of healing. Daniel remained a respectful distance behind her, hands resting at his sides, observing without intruding. He had been present through contracts and negotiations worth millions, yet nothing in his professional life compared to the quiet weight of this moment. Emily stepped closer to the bed and adjusted the blanket gently over her mother's shoulders. Margaret stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering open. You are both still here, she murmured. Of course, Emily said softly. Daniel inclined his head. We promised. Margaret's gaze lingered on him, thoughtful. You keep your word, she said. I try to, he replied. A faint smile touched her lips before she drifted back to sleep. Emily exhaled slowly, shoulders lowering in a way Daniel had not seen before. Relief transformed posture. It softened edges. "You can go back to your meetings now," she said quietly without turning around. "You have already done more than enough." Daniel stepped forward until he stood beside her rather than behind her. "I am not leaving yet," he said. She finally looked at him fully, studying his expression as she had done since the night in the kitchen. There was no impatience there, no calculation, just steadiness. "You really rearranged your schedule for this?" she asked. "Yes." "Why?" The question was no longer defensive. It was sincere curiosity. Daniel considered the answer carefully. "Because I did not want you to sit alone in that waiting room," he said simply. "And because sometimes showing up matters more than signing documents." She absorbed that quietly. Outside the window, early afternoon lights stretched across the city skyline. Traffic moved steadily along the bridge in the distance, ordinary life continuing without pause. Inside the room, time felt different. Slower. Intentional. "I am not used to this," Emily admitted. "To what?" "To someone staying without being asked." The honesty in her voice was unguarded. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the truth to settle between them. "You stayed," he reminded her gently. "Long before I did." A quiet laugh escaped her, light but real. "I was washing dishes." "You were protecting your mother," he corrected. "There is nothing small about that." Their eyes held longer this time. Not with tension, with recognition. The nurse entered briefly to check vitals and confirm visiting hours, then slipped back out. The room felt even quieter afterward. Emily moved to sit in the chair beside the bed. Daniel remained standing until she looked up at him. "You can sit," she said. "I promise I will not charge you for the seat." He smiled faintly and pulled a second chair closer. "That is generous." They sat side by side, not speaking for several minutes. The steady beeping of the monitor created a rhythm that felt almost reassuring. Emily noticed how relaxed his posture seemed without the rigid lines of a conference table. He noticed how her shoulders no longer carried the tightness of exhaustion. "When my father was ill," Daniel said quietly after a while, "I was in a boardroom." She turned toward him, surprised. "I did not know that." "Few do," he replied. "I believed closing a deal that day would secure our future. It did not occur to me that presence was more valuable than profit." His voice did not carry regret as much as reflection. "I cannot change that," he continued. "But I can choose differently now." Emily felt something shift again inside her, something deeper than gratitude. Understanding. "You are not trying to fix the past," she said. "You are trying to honor it." He met her gaze steadily. "That is accurate." Silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It felt shared. Outside, sunlight began to tilt toward late afternoon, casting longer shadows across the floor. Emily reached down and brushed her fingertips lightly against the edge of his hand resting on the armrest. It was not dramatic. It was instinct. He turned his hand gently, allowing their fingers to rest together without force. The contact felt natural, uncomplicated. Neither of them pulled away. Margaret shifted slightly in her sleep, and both of them looked toward her instinctively, their attention aligned without discussion. In that small hospital room, beneath quiet machines and filtered light, something steady began to take shape. Not obligation, not rescue. Something built on shared presence, mutual respect, and the simple decision to remain when walking away would have been easier. Emily looked at him once more, this time without hesitation. "I am glad you did not leave that night," she said softly. Daniel's expression softened in return. "So am I." And for the first time since 3 a.m. in a silent kitchen, neither of them felt alone in what came next. Monday arrived with clear skies and a sharp breeze that carried the scent of early spring through the city streets. Whitmore and Company reopened its doors at 11 a.m. under new ownership, though few customers noticed the subtle shifts. Already underway. The brass fixtures had been polished to a brighter sheen, the host stand repositioned slightly for better flow, and a new operations board hung discreetly behind the kitchen entrance listing updated procedures. Emily stood just inside the doorway at 10:30, dressed not in the standard server uniform, but in tailored black slacks and a crisp white blouse Daniel had insisted the company provide. The fabric felt unfamiliar against her skin, less worn, more structured. She adjusted the cuff at her wrist, reminding herself that clothing did not change who she was. Daniel approached from the hallway leading to the office, jacket folded over his arm as usual, expression composed but observant. "You are early," he noted. "So are you," she replied evenly. A faint smile crossed his face. "Habit." She glanced around the dining room, watching staff prepare for opening. Some of them offered her curious looks, aware of the sudden shift in her role. She met each glance calmly, not defensive, not triumphant. "I do not want them to think I skipped steps," she said quietly. "You did not," Daniel replied. "You earned this through consistency." She nodded, though she understood perception required time to adjust. He handed her a slim tablet device. "Today you observe. Tomorrow you participate. By next week you lead smaller decisions." She accepted the tablet, its weight symbolic in her hands. "You move quickly," she said. "Momentum matters," he repeated, though his tone carried less corporate edge now. They walked toward the kitchen together. Stainless steel counters gleamed under brighter lighting. The industrial sink where he had first seen her still stood in the corner, unchanged. Emily paused briefly in front of it. Daniel noticed. "You can avoid that station if you prefer," he said gently. She shook her head. "No. It reminds me." "Of what?" "Of why I stayed." He studied her expression and saw no resentment there. Only grounding. Staff gathered for a brief pre-shift meeting. Daniel introduced her formally as Management Associate Hayes, outlining her new responsibilities with clarity and respect. He did not mention charity. He did not mention hospital bills. He spoke of discipline, reliability, and leadership potential. Emily felt the room shift subtly as colleagues absorbed his words. After the meeting, she stepped aside with the head chef to review supply orders, her voice steady as she asked questions about vendor schedules and waste. "Percentages," Daniel observed from a distance, resisting the instinct to intervene. She did not need rescue. She needed room. By early afternoon, the restaurant filled with lunch guests. Emily moved through the dining area not as a server, but as a quiet coordinator, checking table turnover times, noting inefficiencies, listening more than speaking. At one point, she caught Daniel watching her from near the bar. "You are evaluating," she said when he approached. "Always," he admitted. "And you are already thinking 3 steps ahead." She tilted her head slightly. "I learned from someone." He smiled at that. Though he understood the compliment carried mutual recognition. During a brief lull, they stepped outside into the narrow alley for air. Sunlight filtered between brick buildings, casting angled shadows across the pavement. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it behind her ear without self-consciousness. "My mother asked about you this morning," she said quietly. "I hope that is not concerning." "She wanted to know if you eat enough," Emily replied, the hint of laughter soft but genuine. Daniel shook his head. "That sounds like her." Silence settled comfortably between them. The alley felt less confined than it had weeks ago. "This is different," Emily said after a moment. "From what I imagined." "In what way?" "I thought power would feel louder," she admitted. "More dramatic." Daniel considered that. "Real power is quiet," he said. "It is the ability to choose how you show up." She looked at him carefully, seeing not the billionaire but the man who had chosen a waiting room over a boardroom. "And how are you choosing?" she asked. He met her gaze steadily, with intention. The simplicity of his answer lingered. A delivery truck pulled up at the curb, breaking the stillness. They stepped back inside together, movements aligned without discussion. As the afternoon progressed, Emily handled her first minor conflict between 2 staff members with calm efficiency, listening fully before offering a practical solution. Daniel watched, impressed not by authority but by empathy. Later, as closing approached, she lingered once more near the sink station. 3 weeks ago," she said softly, "I was standing here alone at 3 in the morning. And now?" he asked. She turned toward him, eyes clear. "Now I am not." The words carried more meaning than location. Daniel stepped closer, close enough to feel the shared warmth of proximity without crossing boundaries. "I did not intend for this to become personal," he said quietly. "Neither did I," she replied. Yet neither of them stepped back. The kitchen lights dimmed gradually as staff clocked out. Stainless steel reflected softer tones now, less harsh. "We should lock up," Daniel said finally. "We should," she agreed. But for a brief moment longer, they stood side by side in the space where everything had begun, aware that something steady had taken root between them. Not rushed, not demanded, simply present, growing in the quiet spaces where both of them had chosen to remain. 2 weeks later, the rhythm of the restaurant felt different, steadier, as if the building itself had adjusted to a new heartbeat. Emily stood in the small glass-walled office overlooking the dining room, reviewing the weekly revenue report on the tablet Daniel had given her. Lunch traffic had increased by 12% since reopening, waste had dropped by 8%, and staff turnover had slowed noticeably. Numbers that once belonged to someone else's responsibility now sat squarely in her hands. She did not treat them lightly. Outside the office window, servers moved with purpose, orders flowed through the kitchen with fewer bottlenecks, and the once chaotic end of shift routine now felt organized. Daniel watched her from across the desk, arms folded loosely, not evaluating but observing growth. "You adjusted the vendor contract," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied without looking up. "They were charging a premium for expedited deliveries we no longer need." He nodded. "You renegotiated without asking me." She finally lifted her gaze. "You told me to think 3 steps ahead." A faint smile touched his face. "I did." Silence settled briefly, comfortable rather than tense. "How is your mother?" he asked. The question carried genuine interest, not obligation. "Stronger every day," she said. "She walked 15 feet without assistance yesterday." Daniel allowed the image to settle in his mind. "That is progress." "It is," she agreed softly. The late afternoon light filtered through the glass panels, casting warm tones across the office. Emily set the tablet down and leaned back slightly in her chair. "I used to measure time in hospital visiting hours," she admitted. "Now I measure it in inventory cycles." "Both require attention," Daniel replied. She studied him carefully. "You do not talk about your family much." He considered the statement rather than deflecting it. "There is not much to discuss," he said calmly. "My parents valued stability. Achievement. Presence was assumed, not examined." "And now?" she asked. He held her gaze evenly. "Now I understand presence must be chosen." The words lingered in the small room. Emily felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest, not sudden or overwhelming, but steady. She had seen him in boardrooms, in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms. Each version carried the same core. Consistency. "You stayed again," she said softly. "You did not have to come in today." "I wanted to see how you handled the afternoon shift," he replied. "That is the professional answer," she said, one eyebrow lifting slightly. He smiled faintly. "The personal answer is that I prefer being here." Her breath caught almost imperceptibly. Outside the office, a server laughed at something near the bar, the sound light and unforced. Life continued without noticing the quiet shift happening behind glass walls. Emily stood and walked toward the window, watching the dining room below. "When I was washing dishes at 3 in the morning, she said quietly, "I did not imagine this." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. She turned toward him slowly. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Of what?" "Of this becoming more than business." He did not answer immediately. He stepped closer, reducing the distance between them to something measured but intentional. "I am cautious," he said honestly, "but not afraid." "Why not?" "Because what we built did not start with attraction," he replied. "It started with respect." The truth of that settled gently between them. There had been no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations. Only presence. Only consistency. Emily felt her pulse steady rather than race. "I do not want to lose myself," she said softly. "You will not," he answered. "Not with me." The confidence in his voice was not possessive. It was reassuring. She searched his eyes one more time, looking for ambition disguised as affection. She found none. Only steadiness. "Then what are we doing?" she asked quietly. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "We are choosing," he said. "Each day." The simplicity of the answer felt right. Outside, the sky shifted toward evening, soft amber fading into deeper blue. The restaurant began preparing for dinner service, lights brightening gradually. Emily stepped closer, closing the final inch of distance. "You could have stayed in that boardroom," she said softly. "You could have ignored a kitchen at 3 in the morning." "I could have," he agreed. "But I did not." She allowed herself a small, steady smile. "I am glad." His hand lifted slowly, not sudden, resting gently at her waist as if asking permission without words. She did not step back. Instead, she placed her hand over his, grounding the gesture in mutual choice. It was not dramatic. It was deliberate. Outside the glass walls, staff moved through their routines unaware that something quiet and meaningful had just taken shape. In a room that once symbolized management and hierarchy, two people stood not as employer and employee, but as partners who had chosen to remain when it mattered. And for the first time since that silent kitchen night, the future felt less like a risk and more like a promise. Evenings settled over the city with a quiet confidence, the kind that arrives after a long day of steady progress. Whitmore and Company glowed warmly against the darkening street, amber lights spilling through tall windows onto the sidewalk. Inside the glass-walled office, Emily stood alone for a moment after Daniel stepped out to greet a visiting investor. She rested her hands lightly on the desk, breathing in the calm she had learned to recognize rather than chase. 3 months ago, her world had been measured in hospital bills and midnight shifts. Now it moved in quarterly projections and staff development plans. Yet somehow, the center of it all felt less about numbers and more about presence. She glanced down at the small notebook she kept in her bag, the one she had used to track her mother's medications and visiting hours. The last page now listed vendor schedules and projected expansion costs. Life had not replaced itself. It had expanded. A soft knock at the glass drew her attention. Daniel stood there, jacket removed, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, expression thoughtful rather than formal. She opened the door. The investor left impressed, he said. He believes we will exceed projections by next quarter. We will, she replied calmly. He studied her face for a moment longer than necessary. You do not seem surprised. I am not, she said. We built this carefully. The word "we" lingered in the air. Neither corrected it. The restaurant buzzed with dinner conversation beyond the office walls, the clink of glasses and low hum of satisfied guests blending into a steady rhythm. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. Your mother called earlier, he said. She wanted to confirm you are eating properly. Emily laughed softly. She will never stop asking that. She also invited me to Sunday dinner. Daniel's expression carried a trace of uncertainty rarely seen in boardrooms. She did. Emily's eyes widened slightly before softening. That means she approves. Of me. Of us. The word arrived gently, but without hesitation. Daniel absorbed it quietly. And do you? He asked. She stepped closer until only inches separated them, her voice steady. I would not have invited you into my life if I did not. The simplicity of her statement carried more weight than any grand declaration. Outside the office, a server passed by, unaware of the shift happening behind glass. Daniel lifted his hand slowly, brushing a strand of hair away from her cheek with deliberate care. There was no urgency in the gesture, only intention. I have spent years building structures, he said softly. Companies, systems, investments. None of them required vulnerability. She met his gaze without flinching. This does. He nodded once. Yes. Silence settled, not uncertain but expectant. I do not want you to feel overshadowed, he continued. Your position here, your growth, it is yours. Not an extension of me. She reached for his hand, grounding the words. I never have, she said. You gave me opportunity. I built from it. He smiled faintly. That is exactly why this works. A sudden cheer rose from the dining room as a birthday dessert was delivered to a table. Life moved forward, ordinary and joyful. Emily glanced toward the sound, then back at him. You asked me once what we are doing, she said. We are choosing. Each day. Daniel nodded slowly. Then let me be clear, he said. I am choosing you. The words were not dramatic. They were measured, deliberate, anchored in the same steadiness that had carried him into a hospital waiting room and a silent kitchen at 3 in the morning. Emily felt her breath catch, not from surprise, but from recognition. And I am choosing you, she replied. The truth of it felt calm rather than overwhelming. No fireworks. No spectacle. Just certainty. Daniel leaned forward, pressing his forehead lightly against hers. A gesture intimate but respectful, built on trust, rather than impulse. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the warmth of shared understanding. In that small office overlooking a thriving restaurant, two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a stainless steel sink now stood as equals. Not rescuer and rescued. Not employer and employee. Partners. The dining room lights glowed brighter as evening deepened, and the city beyond the windows pulsed with life. Emily stepped back just enough to meet his eyes once more. Sunday dinner, she said softly. Do not be late. Daniel smiled, a rare expression free of strategy or calculation. I would not miss it. And for the first time since that quiet night, when steam rose around stainless steel and choices were made without witnesses, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt shared. Sunday arrived with the quiet warmth of early spring sunlight spilling through the curtains of Margaret Hayes's small apartment. The building stood on a tree-lined street only 15 minutes from the restaurant, modest but carefully kept, with flower boxes beginning to show signs of new growth. Inside, the scent of roasted chicken and fresh rosemary filled the air, blending with the faint sweetness of apple pie cooling on the counter. Emily stood at the stove, stirring a pan of vegetables with steady focus, though her heartbeat carried a subtle anticipation that had nothing to do with cooking. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, folding napkins with deliberate care. She moved more easily now, walking without assistance, though Emily still watched her instinctively, as if healing could disappear without warning. You are stirring the same pan for 10 minutes, Margaret observed gently. Emily glanced down and smiled faintly. I am thinking about him. The question carried no teasing edge, only maternal curiosity. Emily did not deny it. Yes. A soft knock sounded at the door precisely at 2 o'clock. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Punctual. Emily wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the door, taking a slow breath before opening it. Daniel stood there in a simple navy sweater and dark trousers, no suit jacket, no tie. In his hands he held a small bouquet of white lilies and a loaf of fresh bread from a neighborhood bakery. He looked less like a billionaire executive and more like a man arriving at someone's home for the first time. Good afternoon, he said, voice steady but softer than usual. You are exactly on time, Emily replied. He stepped inside, glancing around with respectful attention. The apartment was not large, but it felt lived in. Framed photographs lined one wall, showing Emily at different ages, school awards pinned proudly beside them. Daniel paused briefly at a picture of her in a graduation gown, eyes bright with determination. You kept everything, he said quietly. Every milestone, Margaret replied from the table. Please come in. Daniel handed her the flowers. For you. Margaret accepted them with a knowing smile. You did not have to. I wanted to, he answered, and the simplicity of the phrase felt familiar now. They sat together at the small wooden table, the meal served family style. Conversation began with light topics. The restaurant's growth, Margaret's recovery progress, neighborhood updates. But gradually the discussion deepened, shifting into reflections about values and choices. Emily told me you stayed in the waiting room the entire time, Margaret said at one point, studying Daniel carefully. That was important. Daniel folded his hands loosely on the table. It felt necessary. Not everyone understands necessity the same way, Margaret replied. He met her gaze without hesitation. I am learning. Emily watched the exchange quietly, recognizing the unspoken evaluation taking place. Margaret nodded once, satisfied by his steadiness. You both show up, she said. That is rare. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting warm patterns across the table. Laughter surfaced easily as stories from Emily's childhood emerged, some slightly embarrassing, others touching. Daniel listened intently, absorbing details as if they were investments of a different kind. At one point, Margaret excused herself to rest briefly, leaving Emily and Daniel alone at the table. The apartment felt still, comfortable in its simplicity. You look different here, Emily said softly. In what way? Less guarded. He considered that. There is nothing to negotiate here, he replied. Only honesty. She reached for his hand across the table, fingers intertwining naturally. That is why I wanted you here. He held her gaze steadily. I am grateful you did. Silence settled, not heavy but meaningful. The clink of dishes in the sink and the distant hum of traffic outside reminded them that life continued beyond this small room. When I was standing at that sink at 3 in the morning, she said quietly, I did not know my life would shift this way. Neither did I, he admitted, but I would not change the path. Her thumb traced lightly over his knuckles, grounding the words in something tangible. My mother approves, she said with a faint smile. That carries weight. It does, he agreed. Margaret returned a few minutes later, joining them for pie and coffee. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the conversation grew lighter again, filled with small moments of shared humor and quiet understanding. When it was time to leave, Daniel stood by the doorway, lingering slightly as if reluctant to break the atmosphere of warmth. Margaret approached him with measured steps. "Take care of each other," she said. "We will," he replied without hesitation. Outside, the sky glowed with the soft pink hues of late afternoon. Emily walked him down the front steps, the air cool but comfortable. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for inviting me," he answered. They stood there for a moment, city sounds drifting around them. He reached up gently, brushing his fingertips along her cheek in a gesture that held both affection and respect. She leaned into it without hesitation. No rush, no spectacle, just certainty. "I am choosing you," he said quietly once more. "And I am choosing you," she replied. As he walked toward his car, she remained on the steps watching him, aware that the distance between their worlds had never truly been measured in dollars or square footage. It had been measured in presence. And that, she knew now, was something both of them were willing to give. Weeks turned into months with a quiet steadiness that felt earned rather than rushed. Summer light began stretching later into the evenings, casting golden reflections across the polished floors of Whitmore and Company. By now the restaurant no longer felt like a transition space for Emily. It felt like something she had shaped with her own hands. Vendor negotiations bore her signature adjustments. Staff meetings carried her calm authority. Waste reports reflected her discipline. Daniel watched the transformation not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet admiration that grew deeper with each passing day. One late Thursday evening, long after the dinner crowd had thinned and the last check had been signed, Emily stood once more near the stainless steel sink in the back kitchen. The station looked exactly the same as it had months earlier, but she did not. She wore tailored slacks instead of a damp apron. Her hands were no longer raw from soap and hot water. The clock above the prep table read 10:42 p.m., not 3:07 a.m., yet the memory lingered in the air like steam. Daniel stepped into the kitchen, jacket draped over his arm, sleeves slightly rolled as they often were at the end of the day. He paused when he saw her standing there. "You still visit this spot?" he observed gently. She nodded. "It reminds me." "Of exhaustion?" he asked. "Of resolve," she corrected. She turned to face him fully. "Everything changed here. Not because you paid a bill, but because you noticed." The word landed with quiet weight. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until only inches remained. "You were impossible not to notice," he replied softly. She studied him with the same careful attention she had given every major decision in her life. "You did not rescue me," she said. "You stood beside me." "That was always the intention," he answered. The kitchen lights reflected faintly in his eyes, softer now than the sharp glint she had first associated with boardrooms and acquisitions. Outside, the city hummed in the distance, summer air pressing lightly against the windows. "The board approved the expansion plan," he said quietly. "2 new locations. I want you overseeing the second one." She inhaled slowly, absorbing the scale of what he was offering. "That is not a small step," she said. "Neither were you," he replied. A smile flickered across her lips. "You are very certain." "I am," he said without hesitation. She walked past him toward the prep table, running her fingertips lightly across the cool steel surface. "When I was standing here at 3 in the morning," she said, "I was praying for enough to get through the week. I did not imagine leading an expansion." He stepped behind her, close enough that his presence felt steady but not overwhelming. "You did not imagine it," he said, "because you were focused on survival. Now you are building." She turned slowly until they faced each other fully. The distance between them felt deliberate rather than accidental. "And what are we building?" she asked quietly. He did not answer with strategy or metrics. "A life," he said simply. The word hung between them, not dramatic, not rushed. Earned. She felt the truth of. It settled deep in her chest. "You are asking for more than partnership," she said. "Yes," he replied. There was no grand speech, no elaborate promise, only clarity. "I have built companies," he continued softly. "I have built portfolios. I want to build something that lasts beyond contracts and quarterly reports." Her heartbeat steadied rather than raced. "You want forever," she said. "I want commitment," he corrected gently. "The kind that shows up even when it is inconvenient." She remembered the waiting room, the hospital corridor, the small apartment filled with rosemary and warm sunlight. "You have already shown that," she said. He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. Then let me say it plainly, he said. I love you. The words were not loud. They did not echo. They settled, warm and unwavering. She searched his eyes one last time, not for doubt, but for consistency. She found the same steadiness that had stood in a silent kitchen months earlier. I love you, she replied. No hesitation. No fear of losing herself. Because she had not been diminished. She had grown. The hum of the refrigerator units and the faint ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet space around them. Daniel lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss across her knuckles, a gesture respectful and deliberate. She stepped closer, resting her forehead lightly against his. In the place where exhaustion once lived, certainty now stood. Not built on wealth. Not built on rescue. Built on presence. Built on choice. And as the kitchen lights dimmed gradually for the night, the stainless steel sink reflected two figures standing side by side, no longer separated by status or circumstance, but united by the quiet decision to stay. Autumn arrived gently, brushing the city with cooler air and early hints of amber along the trees that lined the avenue outside Whitmore and Company. The restaurant had expanded into its second location 3 weeks earlier, a renovated corner space 12 blocks north, and tonight marked its official grand opening. Inside, warm Edison lights glowed against exposed brick walls, polished wood tables reflecting the soft hum of conversation as invited guests filled the room. Emily stood near the entrance, dressed in a deep emerald dress that carried the quiet confidence she had grown into, her posture composed, her expression calm. She was no longer learning the systems. She was leading them. Across the room, Daniel greeted investors and community leaders with his usual measured grace, yet his attention returned to her instinctively, as if recalibrating toward the place that mattered most. Months earlier, a stainless steel sink had framed the beginning of something neither of them understood. Now polished glass and warm light framed its continuation. Emily moved through the dining room with quiet authority, adjusting a seating chart, checking in with the head chef, reassuring a nervous host who was new to the team. Staff responded to her not because she held a title, but because she had earned their respect. She knew the cost of every late night and the weight of every decision. She had lived it. Daniel approached her near the bar, where crystal glasses lined up in perfect symmetry. The first reservation is requesting you personally, he said softly. They read about your story in the local business column. She exhaled gently. I do not want this to become about headlines. It is not, he replied. It is about leadership. She studied him for a moment, recalling the night he had first stood in silence watching her wash dishes long after everyone else had gone home. Leadership looks different at 3 a.m, she said quietly. Yes, he agreed. That is why it lasts. A server passed carrying a tray of appetizers, the scent of rosemary and roasted garlic drifting briefly between them. The restaurant pulsed with energy, yet beneath the noise there was steadiness. Emily glanced toward the large windows facing the street. Outside, city lights reflected against the glass like distant constellations. Do you ever think about that night? She asked. Daniel followed her gaze. Every day, he answered honestly. It changed more than a balance sheet. She smiled faintly. It changed me too. He turned toward her fully, lowering his voice. You were strong before I walked in. Strength can still feel lonely, she replied. He understood the weight of that sentence. For years he had carried responsibility in isolation, believing independence equaled success. Now he recognized the quiet power of shared presence. A ripple of applause moved through the room as the mayor stepped forward to offer brief remarks about local business growth. Emily and Daniel stood side by side near the front, listening without the need to command attention. When the ribbon was cut and glasses were raised, the celebration felt earned rather than extravagant. Later, as the evening thinned and guests departed into the cool night air, the staff gathered in the center of the dining room. Emily thanked them individually, acknowledging specific contributions rather than offering generic praise. She understood that recognition, like opportunity, must be intentional. Daniel watched with admiration that no longer surprised him. When the last employee clocked out and the doors were locked, silence settled gently across the new space. It was not the heavy silence of exhaustion. It was the quiet after accomplishment. Emily walked slowly toward the kitchen, pausing at the gleaming sink station installed against the far wall. It was newer, brighter, untouched by long nights. She ran her fingertips lightly along its edge. Daniel joined her without speaking. Different kitchen, he said softly. Same lesson, she replied. He nodded. Presence over power. Respect over rescue, she added. Their reflections shimmered faintly in the polished steel. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box, not dramatic in size or presentation, but deliberate. Emily noticed the shift in his posture before she saw the object in his hand. Her breath steadied rather than quickened. You once told me you did not want to lose yourself, he said quietly. I have watched you become more of yourself every day. She held his gaze, understanding forming even before the box opened. I am not asking you to step into my world, he continued. I am asking to build one with you. He opened the box, revealing a simple ring, elegant and unpretentious, reflecting light without spectacle. The kitchen felt still, almost sacred in its quiet. I love you, he said. Not because you needed saving. Not because you transform my company. But because you choose to show up. For your mother. For your team. For me. Tears gathered in her eyes. Not from surprise, but from recognition of the journey that had led them here. You stood beside me when it mattered, she said softly. You never tried to lead from ahead or push from behind. He stepped closer, holding the ring between steady fingers. Emily Hayes, will you continue choosing with me? The question did not echo. It settled gently into the space between them. She looked around the quiet kitchen, remembering steam, exhaustion, resolve. She looked back at him, seeing the same man who had chosen a waiting room over a boardroom, who had sat at her mother's small kitchen table without pretense. Yes, she answered without hesitation. I will. He slid the ring onto her finger, the motion simple and sure. No grand audience. No flashing cameras. Just two people standing in the quiet place where everything began. He kissed her softly, respectful and unhurried, a gesture rooted in partnership rather than spectacle. When they stepped back, the new kitchen reflected them not as separate figures, but as a unified silhouette against warm light. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that within these walls something enduring had been sealed. Months later, on a crisp winter afternoon, friends and family gathered in a small ceremony held in the original restaurant dining room, the first location that had carried both struggle and transformation. Margaret walked carefully but confidently down the aisle, pride evident in every step. Emily stood radiant, not defined by hardship or rescue, but by growth. Daniel waited at the front, composed yet visibly moved. Their vows were simple: presence, respect, partnership. No promises of perfection. Only commitment to show up, even when it was inconvenient, even when it required humility. When they were pronounced husband and wife, applause filled the room, echoing gently against brick walls that had once witnessed quiet exhaustion. Later that evening, as guests departed and staff cleared tables, Emily slipped away briefly to the kitchen. She stood once more near the sink, now polished and unused at that late hour. Daniel found her there, as he always seemed to. You are still drawn here, he observed softly. She nodded. It reminds me that quiet moments can change everything. He wrapped his arm gently around her waist, both of them gazing at the stainless steel surface reflecting their joined hands. You did not raise your voice, he said quietly. You raised the standard. She smiled, leaning into him. And you did not rescue me, she replied. You respected me. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, soft flakes settling against the windows. Inside, warmth held steady, and in the quiet hum of a kitchen that had once framed exhaustion and now framed commitment, they understood something simple and lasting. The people who work the hardest are often unseen, but when someone chooses to see them, everything can change. Not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of presence. And presence, when chosen consistently, becomes love. If this story touched you, leave a comment, share where you are watching from, and how would you rate this story. And if you want more powerful journeys like this one, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Love After Everything for more heartfelt stories about strength, dignity, and choosing love when it matters most.